is we're going to have a chat about the idea of seasonal change, transit time, microbiota in forage-fed horses. Bit of a tongue twister, that one. And the idea here is to sort of think about the impact that what we feed and the way that we feed impacts how that transits through the horse's digestive tract, and the impact that this has on the microbiota and the mechanisms that the horse employs to try and extract the optimal nutrients. Now, the majority of this work was based on the work done by Carlette Fernandez in her PhD, and then some background work that we've been doing alongside that, looking at pasture and composition and transit time in a number of other studies. So if we start at sort of the beginning, the idea of why we're interested in this, particularly from a sort of a New Zealand or an Australasian perspective, and for us, we have temperate climates, and so we have year-round access to pasture with the majority of our equine livestock that we keep in the production cycle. So the brood mares and the young stock, and so pasture plays a major role in the equine diet. And needless to say, even though it's a temperate climate, there are seasonal variations in both the pasture composition and the nutrient composition of that pasture, and you would expect logically that has an impact then on the microbiota and the way that the horse responds to those challenges. And so we've got here in this little image here, there are a couple of students that are pasture plating a typical stud farm situation in New Zealand, with the brood mares at pasture, and trying to understand the idea of pasture mass that is on offer and pasture consumption. And so this sort of gives you a bit of an idea of sort of the typical, or the way that we tend to operate here in New Zealand, and sort of the environment that we're going to be sort of talking about when we talk about the seasonal variation. Now, when we talk about pasture composition in New Zealand, the majority of our pastures are perennial ryegrass and a white clover mix. And you can see here, this is some data that was collected from approximately 70 commercial stud farms in New Zealand. And we managed to sort of synthesize it and get a bit of an idea of some of the seasonal variation and the composition of the pasture to understand what's occurring here. You can see we've categorized it as ryegrass, which is the primary grass species, and then we've listed it as other when we talk about the botanical composition, other pasture, other grasses, the white clover. Then we've got the category weeds, and it's probably worth mentioning here, weeds technically, it's something that doesn't fit in the ryegrass, the grass, or the white clover mix. And so some of these are like species like plantain, which, while technically we'd say within this sward is considered to be a bit of a weed, it actually has some nutritional value and may, depending on the time of the year, make up a composition of the diet. You can see it's not a particularly high composition, but it's just sort of sitting in there. The other category that we use when we look at botanical composition is the idea of dead matter. And so this really gives us a little bit of an idea of pasture on offer, pasture growth in front of the animals, and an idea of what is occurring there. And you can see, if we have a look at, if we start with the dead matter to sort of talk about that idea of seasonal supply and seasonal growth, the idea there, dead matter, you can see that there is a spike or an increase in dead matter during that summer period. And that's reflecting that we've got growth, the growth that's in front of those animals. And we tend to have, if you think back to that image that we had in front of you there, under commercial operations, we tend to have adequate feed supply. So they've actually got more growth in front of those animals than actually they are consuming, and hence where we end up with an increase in dead matter there. Whereas during autumn and winter, the growth and the consumption is more in sync, and so we don't end up with that large period of dead matter. From a growth perspective, you can see that we've got ryegrass, very good growth during spring, summer, a little bit of an ebb there as we sort of get a bit of a drying out, and then again autumn, and then relatively good composition during winter. white clover. And again, you know, if we think about the idea of what these pasture species are bringing to the mix and the bits and pieces, the idea of white clover there, we see that basically during winter it is very, very limited growth and composition, and then spring and summer we've got some relatively good values there. So again, thinking about what that's bringing to the equation with regards to the digestible energy and the relative contribution of protein within that pasture mix. So sort of we've looked at that idea of the sward and the sward mix. And so really now let's have a little bit of a look at the idea of what it is from a nutrient composition rather than from a botanical composition. So we do see a seasonal fluctuation, and it reflects a little bit of that composition that we were talking about there. The digestible energy, it's worth mentioning here that New Zealand pastures, and this is what we're based on. So we've got when we talk about the transference of these results and the idea that it's the patterns that we were expecting and that we'll look at, but the relative numeracy of the changes may differ depending on the nutrient composition. And so with this digestible energy, you'll notice pretty quickly when we start looking at this from DE values that these are relatively high, and we do have relatively high DE values in our pasture mix here in New Zealand. The other thing that also probably is a little bit different to particularly the North American temperate grasses is the idea here of the level of crude protein. And so we actually have relatively high levels of crude proteins at some periods, particularly if you look during the spring, and even during that summer period where we've a little bit of reduced rainfall and so reduced growth, etc. The idea we still have, compared to temperate grasses, relatively high levels of crude protein. And so you're starting to sort of get a bit of an idea there that what we're seeing in front of us is a relatively high DE pasture mix with relatively high crude protein. And this does have an influence on the microbiota and the relative distribution of what we're going to see within the different phylum. So sort of, yeah, it's just that coming back to, so we sort of realized from the data that we've got that there's seasonal changes in pasture composition and nutritive value. The feed supply and the feed demand also has an impact, and we'll look at that with regards to the transit time, because the relative quantities can impact on the microbiota as to what is available, the amount of time that is available to digest it. So we really then, this is part of what we want to do with Carlet's thesis, is then think about the idea of what are the differences observed in the other differences observed in the pasture sufficient to sort of change and to drive changes in the microbiota, and if are those changes something that we can quantify and start to understand and what impact that has on relative digestibility and feed utilization. Now, the experimental design, or the way that we tackled this data is a little bit opportunistic, because we used mares that were within our university teaching herd. And so this is a slightly skewed population in that we have mares in this cohort, and they tend to be older mares. And so we've just got to bear that in mind. It shouldn't alter things, but it is just one of those things that you need to think about with your age and demographic profile. And it's probably worth mentioning here, the rationale behind this was that this, while it's a slightly older population than we'd say with our commercial broodmare population, it did give us the ability to know that we had the known management, we could quantify what's happening with the management, and we could follow those animals through over a successive 12-month period, because that's the sort of the difficulty if you're working in a commercial operation, is to have the number of animals required and that continuity of animals. And so we're not chopping and changing, because if we're changing those animals that are contributing at the different seasons, then we don't really know that that's a season effect. It may be just driven by inter-horse variation, and that has been highlighted in some earlier studies. Body weight, they were predominantly thoroughbred and standardbred mares of typical body weight, body condition score 5 out of a 9-point scale with an interquartile range of 5 to 6, and this remained remarkably consistent throughout. Because an older population, we did a Cresty neck score and looked at that again just to make sure that we didn't have anything in there with PPID or something that may be influencing or altering it because, of the age profile that we had. We wanted to be careful and make sure that we didn't have any issues with that. From a management point of view, and this is, again, it's this trade-off of working with a sample that you're going to be able to go back and sample, and you're going to know the management, but they probably run, a little bit tighter or differently compared to a commercial operation. So here, very similar to a commercial situation in the southern hemisphere, where the horses are rotated between paddocks and are provided with a certain level of pasture mass in front of them. So typically went into the pasture with approximately, 4 centimeters sward height, or about 1,200, 1,300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare of pasture in front of them. This is a little bit lower than you'd find in commercial situations. And so again, it's something that you've got to bear in the back of your mind. But again, we're looking at the relative seasonal changes. And so the management of the animals was pretty consistent throughout. Composition, you can see the variation in the plucks there. It's a fairly typical sort of equine pasture where, ryegrass, clover species, other grasses are sitting within that. The temperate climate means that we don't get a cessation of pasture growth in New Zealand, but we do supplement with conserved forages such as hay, and in this case it was meadow hay, and it was provided at about a rate of 6 to 10 kilograms dry matter per horse per day, and that's the what was provided. It's not necessarily what was consumed, because given fed out in pasture, there's a bit of wastage there. But this is one of the things that we have in there, is that this seasonal change has a large impact on the forage and the forage composition, relative forage composition in front of us, and so that then alters the feed supply. So it's not truly just pasture based, but it is, trying to reflect what's happening under commercial operations, or at least that seasonal trend. The sampling and to try and collect the data. So we sampled on 4 occasions, and this was for the microbiota. So for the microbiota, we sampled on 4 occasions to try and get a bit of an idea of the seasonality. Sampled at the same period of same time of the day, and samples were obtained peri-rectum. So we knew exactly that it was from that animal. Snap frozen and liquid nitrogen, the little subsamples, and then we subsequently did the analysis. For the pasture, we sampled the pasture monthly, and so we took basically 50 samples within the what we call grab samples within the paddock, and to obtain 1 kilogram of pasture mass, which we then mixed up and then subsampled for subsequent analysis. With the hay, we took core and surface samples on monthly occasions from a random collection of bales that were being offered, and so that gave us a little bit of an idea of, was there any change in the pasture on offer, and not pasture, the hay that was on offer, and the idea of how that relatively would have contributed to things, and the impact that may have had. The microbiota, and to understand from the microbiota, so nucleic acids extracted, from about 100 milligrams of fecal samples, phenylchloroform purification, and the QA Quick 90 PCR purification kit. So fairly standard sort of stock standard protocols there. The samples were then normalized to 500 nanograms per microliter DNA, which is again, fairly standard for doing the 16 RS library preps. We then used the Illumina 2-step PCR preparation method to extract the data, so we could understand what we had at a phylum and a genus level. And again, we'll have a little bit of a talk about this, about what level we need to get down to, and to try and understand it, and the difficulty with sometimes trying to quantify what is going on. So what did we see when we were looking at looking at the pasture composition, and so you can see here the pasture cover on offer was fairly consistent when we had a look. So it's probably a fraction on the tight side, but it was adequate to meet their requirements. The idea of the climate and what was going on here gives you an idea of the temperate climate that these animals were exposed to, and the mean daily the mean daily rainfall gives you a bit of an indication of the rainfall and the effect that that has on pasture supply. It's worth noting that the summer period was a bit drier than normal, and when we see this sort of translated in some of the feed values, because this impacted on pasture growth. But what I've provided in the graph below there is a little bit of, for those that are interested from an agronomy point of view or an understanding of the idea of the seasonality of the growth there, 2 seasons worth of pasture growth from these paddocks in this area, to give you a little bit of an idea of the usual fluctuations we see in the quantities that are offered in front. So, we'll get up to about 60 to 70 kilograms dry matter per day during peak growth periods, and then the idea we drop down to sort of around about 6 to 10 kilograms of dry matter per hectare during the winter period. So you can see we don't end up with this complete loss of pasture growth, and the idea there that this is, we do have relatively good levels of feed supply and feed demand. Now, when we look here at the idea of our feed samples and the idea of what we've got in front of us, we've got the rows here, and we're going to have a little bit of a look at it, but it's really just this overview of the amount that was actually in front of us. And the idea of, we've got P and H. So P is the pasture samples and H are the hay samples. So when we were offering hay to these animals, then we have that relative nutrient composition during that time period that we sampled at. This is the monthly sampling. And so the idea that we can see during September to November, sort of an increase in sward height and pasture cover, and an increase in the hot water soluble carbohydrates. And then if we go sort of early autumn, then we get an increase in the non-soluble carbohydrate. And so a little bit of an idea that there are these fluctuations in these variables, and we'll have a bit of a look at it when we look at the relative contribution of the composition, because particularly the HWSC percentage, it gives you a little bit of an idea of how this has an impact on the relative microbiota, and I guess you'd say the substrate that's been offered in front of the microbiota, and is to the impact that this has on the relative distribution. So once we'd extracted the microbiota and a bit of an idea of sort of the samples that we obtained, so with the number of animals that we had and the sampling period, we got two reads which didn't make any biological sense at all. They were completely skewed, and so they were removed from the data set. So we ended up with 118 samples, but it gives you a bit of an idea of the quantity of data that was available. Of the original OTUs, the original taxonomic units, you can see we ended up with nearly 5,000 of these on average. The idea of the total bacterial sequences obtained, over 2 million. And so from that, we had at least 33 bacterial phyla that we were able to detect, 90 different taxonomic classes, 170 orders, 32 families, and 646 genera. So we are dealing with a relatively diverse population, but as we start looking at the data, you start to see that it actually is clustered. And you'll see that basically the Bacteroides and the Firmicutes are the ones that really dominate this, and this gives us a bit of an idea of the primary drivers in the microbiota and sort of the way it responds. And we've got these major players and perhaps a couple of others that are sort of was going to say dancing around the edges, but contributing a little bit to the variation. But it's these two groups that are the major players. Now, if we look at the idea of what we've got, remember we were looking and trying to quantify. We're looking at basically the variation in the composition, the richness, and the way that things change in the variation. And so, what we've done here is we've taken the data and we've looked at it with the idea of the pasture and the pasture and the hay. So we've got these two quite distinct sort of feeding periods. You can see when we look at the relative diversity that the changes in those relative diversity indexes, so whether we use Simpson's or the Shannon-Weiner as an example, the values don't differ dramatically. We're not talking massive swings in the pendulum, but we're talking about subtle changes and tweaks. And you can see, if we use Simpson's here, we've only moved by 0.1 of a point there, but when we look at it across what we had in the idea of the way that Simpson's diversity calculates it, it gives us an indication that this is a significant change. So this idea of adding hay to the diet and changing it, this caused a shift, and so there is a change based on the composition, based on the nutrient intake. And while it's very subtle, it actually is sitting there and it's starting to tell us that we have something that's very, very quantifiable. And when we look at this starts to tell us a little bit of a story as to what we can expect, or perhaps what once we start looking at it at a phyla level. So if we look at the idea of the composition of the data here at the composition at phyla level, and we start looking at what we've got. And I talked about the idea of basically it being driven by these two contributors, and the idea of the Firmicutes and the Bacteroides. And so these two these two phyla are actually driving the composition, and it's really, if we look at the composition of the other groups, and be careful about the language here, the other phyla, when we talk about it here, you can see that it stays relatively the same, but it's actually this ratio, or this understanding of what's going on between the Bacteroides and the Firmicutes that is really starting to change us, because the diversity index are based on not just what you're seeing, but the relative abundance of those two there. And so it starts to show us that yes, this is what's going. If we have a look here, we can see that with the pasture, we've got the idea that the roughly about 60% is driven by the Firmicutes. That increases to nearly 70% when we start talking about the idea of the pasture and the hay, and there's a slight reduction in the Bacteroides, but yeah, a little, but it's a little bit of a change and consolidation in some of the other groups that we were looking at. And so that's really this idea of these two major players that are really contributing to the microbiota. And when we look at them together, the idea here is that what we've got here is that about 80% of that community is driven by those two phyla. And so the others are those, as I talked about, those minor players that are sort of dancing around or contributing, but it is these two phyla that really make the difference. So that we could see that from the bar graph. The plot on your right hand side there is a principal component plot, trying to see the idea of trying to say what is the relative relationship of those samples that we took and where they sat with regards to the composition on a principal component. And the idea of, you can see that and it starts to tell a bit of a story, really. There's this idea we can separate it out based on pasture and hay, and sort of, if you look at it in the bar graphs, it makes you think that it's an absolute and very clear definition, but there's an overlap, and so this relative contribution depends on some of the between horse variation, but the idea that those that stacked bar graph gives you an indication of the overall population trend, whereas that principal component plot gives you a little bit of an idea of the relative separation and distribution, but that we've got this, some, depending on the horses, the magnitude and where they sit in the nature of how far they sort of separate out. And that's, again, probably another thing that's worth thinking about, is that we do find consistently, whether it's the transit time or the seasonal, change is that there are large differences between horses in the way that they are responding. And again, it comes back to, I guess, that idea of what's that initial microbiota that we're starting with, that host microbiota community and interrelationship, and the impact that that actually has on the relative microbiota and what we're identifying within that. So I've sort of got a little bit ahead of myself there, really, when I started talking about the drivers of the inter and individual horse variation. So here you can see we're looking at the variation between horses and the idea of the impact that that has. And so when we look at the idea of pasture or pasture and hay, in both of those categorizations where we've broadly taken those and looked at them, the idea here is we can see that we've got these differences based on the Curtis dissimilarity index, the idea that we've actually got these differences between horses and they are significant. So again, this is at a population level, this is what occurs in these oscillations, but the magnitude and the nature of the change is quite dependent on that individual horse. Yeah. Okay, so when we again start to look at this, and with that first bit that we talked about was the idea of looking at if we're just offering pasture, if we're just offering pasture and hay. Now what we're doing is we're trying to say, okay, this is the seasonal, or the seasonality, I guess you'd say it's probably more appropriate, seasonality in the way that they are offered forage and conserve forage and the pasture and what's going on. And so you can see here the idea of, we talked about these subtle changes, but they're significant given the numbers that we're looking at and the magnitude of what's going on. And so if we look at the Simpsons diversity index there, you can see that during autumn, we had an increase in that diversity index and a change compared to spring, summer, and winter. And so that's sort of, and it's a very similar trend if we use the Shannon-Weiner index. And so we're sort of saying, okay, when we look numerically at this, that we're sort of starting to see a little bit of this period, autumn, being slightly different to what we're observing with the spring and the summer. And so if we then look at the figure below, which is, again, it's another principal component analysis, but it provides a nice way of separating out and trying to understand what's going on. And so when you see this idea of the clustering there, and we've got, as we go along, and it's probably we've got them color coded there for summer, autumn, winter, and spring, and you can start to see the idea there that the temperate effect, or the seasonality effect, on the relative diversity in the microbiota and what we're observing. And so it is telling us that there are these seasonal effects. It's starting to say, okay, this is driven by the idea of, you can see our clustering, even though this is on a monthly level with the color coding, but the idea that we've got this clustering and that it's been driven. There are some homogeneous periods when we look at that idea, April through to almost December, where it's actually behaving quite similarly. But that January, February, March for us actually ended up that sort of autumn period where it was a bit drier and things sort of changed a bit for us, that this reacted and the horses reacted differently with their microbiota. Now, if we talk about, again, looking at these seasonal components and the idea of the relative contribution, and this is just taking that data that we had and looking on the top, we've got the phylum level, and then below we've got the genus level. And so, again, if we start at the top at the phylum, we can see, it's our Firmicutes and our Bacteroides that are really driving this. And you start to get a bit of an idea of these monthly, the monthly variations that we are observing here, and the idea of how this interrelates, and the relative distribution. You can see it quite clearly if we look. It's better if we look at that monthly sampling. And the idea of that relative variation there. And I think just looking at this, actually, I probably had that crook because we took monthly samples rather than peri-rectum for the microbiota. You're probably wondering why if I'd put in there that we sampled it quarterly, but we didn't, sampled it monthly. So the idea here is you can pick up and you can start to see these variations in the idea, and we really want to hone in on those. Basically, if we look at the blue at the bottom, which is the Firmicutes, and the red, which is the Bacteroides, the relative ratio there, which is starting to give us a bit of an idea of perhaps the relative substrate that's been offered and the quantities of that substrate that's been offered, because that's starting to, those are the drivers of what's really going on. If we go back, it was the idea that it was the 80%. The genus level, we've got it's a little bit, it's a little bit messier, but again you can see this general trend of these clustering, and some of these were unclassified genus, but we had them within the different families there, and you can see sort of we've got the bottom there the idea of the Bacteroides and contributing significantly to it when we look at the relative genus that is within the population of the microbiota. Again, you can see, the levels are relatively consistent, and it's more a little bit of, I was going to say subtle tweaking, but it is really, it's this relative ratio, and it's driven again, it's Firmicutes versus the Bacteroides, and that starts driving and then nudges some of those others and creates a little bit of an issue for them, and as to what they can and they can't contribute. And this idea of, if we talk about the microbiota being a balanced ecosystem, but it is driven by those two major players that are really contributing to it. Now, we talked about the idea of sort of, okay, we've collected some nutrient input data. We've looked at the idea of the pasture composition, and trying to understand and trying to relate what's been going on. So what we've got here is we've placed 3 genuses. So what have we got there? Genus 1, unclassified genus within Firmicutes, genus 2 within Bacteroides, like Spirae, and Clostridiales. And so what we've done is just taken the most abundant of the genus that we were able to identify. And then what we've done within that is then looked at it and the association with some of the nutritional parameters that we obtained. And so, it's the idea that the red represents and this is sort of a heat map, so it gives you a bit of an idea of the trends and the way that it works. And the idea is that the red represents the idea of a very strong negative correlation, and the blue represents a very strong positive correlation. And so let's check. Yeah, so if we have a little bit of a look here, and the idea of what we've got and the relative changes, we can see if we look at the idea, there's genus 2 and genus 4 interrelating. The relative values are strongly sort of negative, so they're playing against, the idea is they're playing against each other. And then if we look at the hot water soluble carbohydrate, a little bit of an idea of the relative interrelationship there. I've got to make sure I'm on the right line. The hot water soluble carbohydrate, the genus 2 versus genus 4, you can see genus 2, of the Bacteroides, the idea that hot water soluble carbohydrate, as that's going up, we're seeing a bit of a reduction there, whereas in genus 4, the Clostridiales, or that unclassified genus within there, we were seeing a relative increase. And again, it comes back to this idea of the fluctuations against these two were, I guess, for want of a better word, we're jostling against each other. And the idea that when we look at it, this hot water soluble carbohydrate and the percentage of that was telling us what was a primary driver within the different parameters that we quantified to understand what was going on. If we look at the other thing there is, again, we can see a very similar relationship again with the idea of the amount of protein that was going on in there. let me check in the protein. So again, this may be relating to the composition, and then this is a little bit, it probably is worth mentioning, a little bit of a difficulty. The composition, yes, that certainly probably is a primary driver. We could say the nutritional content, but also it's probably, if we think back to what we had with regards to our pasture composition, the idea of pasture growth, the relative abundance. So it's, again, you know, it's that substrate and the quantities of the substrate that are available that may be driving some of these observations that we are seeing here. Yeah, so I've sort of jumped ahead of myself a little bit there. Okay, so the seasonal effects. So when pasture is growing in the vegetative phase, then basically we saw the firmicutes that were dominated the bacterial community, whereas when things sort of dried, we got lower crude protein, lower soluble carbohydrate, then the bacterioides increased, you know, and that was at the expense of the firmicutes. So it's sort of, yeah, that's sort of a verbalization of what we could have seen with that heat map, and the idea of what's driving these changes, or what these changes are, how these changes are coming about. Now, the next sort of thing is we've looked at this idea of the effect that seasonal supply, and I guess, you know, it's a bit of its relative composition. But in the second part here, what we're going to look at is the idea of transit time, and this is it's a little bit of a little bit. It was, yeah. I'll tell you a bit of the story as we get into it, but it's the idea of feed supply, because we talked about variation in feed profile, but feed supply per se may actually also have a bit of an impact, and it's worth keeping that in mind as we start thinking about the horse, because the horse is a relatively, it is an interesting creature with regards to the idea of nutrition. So if we sort of go to the idea of, well, why do we care, or why would we look at the idea of transit time and worry about it? And so when we talk about the horse, and from an evolutionary point of view, you know, the horses, when, you know, that's why you're here, you're well aware of it, but the horse is a hindgut fermenter. About 60% of D that's required can be obtained via volatile fatty acids. But, you know, that the setup of being a monogastric hindgut fermenter is less efficient than a ruminant. And so from an evolutionary point of view, one of the mechanisms that the horse seems to have compensated for this is the idea that if you're a ruminant, you've got to, you know, you work on that system of trying to squeeze as much as you can out of the feed that's on offer, whereas the horse seems to have a bit of a trade-off and a bit of an idea that it's trying to really be an optimizer rather than a maximizer. And you sort of see that, you know, it's an evolutionary advantage based on the variable feed quality that horses evolved to eat, particularly, you know, relatively high dry matter content, high fiber. And so, you know, we look at that, the lovely work that was done a couple of years, I think it was Duggan from memory, with Pat Harris, and the idea of actually the restricting feed access and then feed supply and what was consumed in those little ponies, and demonstrate, you know, that within 3 hours these ponies were able to consume about 40% of their DE requirements, basically because they weren't constrained in the same way that a ruminant is. And so this does give us a bit of an idea that, okay, the horse actually can tweak this transit time, whether it's a response to feed, or it's a more systemic response. But the idea is there's an opportunity to alter transit time, and we know, you know, the idea from the published literature that we see large variations in transit time published depending on the forage substrate and the management system. Okay, so yeah, so I've sort of waffled through that a little bit. I apologize, you know, the idea, but if you restrict feed intake, and we've got some regression models to show you, you know, theoretically reduce supply, then you reduce the transit time, which then allows the horse to extract a little bit more from it. So the question then really becomes, from a microbiota point of view, is that we're actually altering what's there and the amount of time to utilize that substrate. And so does that have an impact on the microbiota of the horse? Now, we were actually primarily interested in the idea of changes in forage-based diet, and this is how we sort of ended up getting to this idea of transit time, because it wasn't, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it wasn't primarily driven from this. What we're actually looking at is the idea of, and it's an important thing to set up, but the idea of changes in forage base and the impact that that had on microbiota. So we had a 3x3 Latin squeeze design. We were offering different types of forage, which was basically conserved forage, fresh conserved and sold forage, the idea of fresh cut pasture, because, needless to say, you can't have a horse out at a pasture with this, because you've got to actually feed offered, feed consumed, and then the idea of hay and oats. And so it provided a mechanism, and within this trial, it was 1 week on each of these forages with a 1 week pasture washout is the way that we intended it to work. So a bit of a stylization of what we had, and the idea of how we tweaked these different diets. What's of interest here and what we're going to focus on here is the idea of these washout periods, relative washout periods we provided during week 1, week 2, and week 5, because this is what we were looking at, is the relative transit time from with in essence what was the same pasture forage, a pasture that was on offer. It's a little bit of a figure, and it's really demonstrates, some of the fun and games, or the difficulties with trying to do transit time in horses. And you can use a variety of different markers and mechanisms to try and understand. We used little PVC beads and color coded, so we knew at which time period these were offered. But when you start thinking of the logistics, you start to realize why sampling periods are reduced, and why, to a certain extent, people are not overly enthusiastic to embark in these types of studies, because if you start thinking about the quantities of feces that are voided per day, and then having to filter through those at regular intervals to try and identify what beads and how many beads were yielded to try and get an idea of what's going on, you can start to see that logistically it's an awful lot of work. Now, I mentioned that our primary purpose of this study was to look at the idea of the different forage types, and but what inadvertently occurred is the idea of, because of, in essence, what happened is our mower broke down, and so in the first week we ended up with a reduced, lower quantities of pasture. They were still adequate, but lower quantities of pasture that were on offer compared to the subsequent 2 pasture washout periods. And so this actually provided an interesting thing, because there was a alteration in what we were observing in the relative transit time, based on the idea of the abundance of that pasture that was put in front of those horses. So this is how we inadvertently ended up sort of starting to go, oh, transit time may have an effect on the microbiota. Okay, so if we talk about the idea of the nutrient analysis, and we're not really overly concerned about the idea of what we have with the other forages on offer, because that's not what we're interested in at the moment. But what we're interested in is looking at these values or variables, which is P1, P2, P3, which are the pasture washout periods. And you can see that based on this nutrient composition here, we've got relatively homogeneous nutrient composition, and we were collecting the pasture from the same paddock. It was all within this relatively small temporal window, and so this is fair enough to see that we didn't actually see much variation between those different different time periods of offering the pasture. You'll see that the pasture composition is very similar to what we were seeing with the samples that we were talking about, or right at the beginning there when we looked at those surveys of stud farms. So with an adequate sward height, then we're talking about here, you know, that you could see when those mowers were cutting it, we're about 4,000 kilograms dry matter per hectare. So a decent sward height on there, and the idea of where we were with regards to the dry matter and the crude protein, again reflecting what we see in sort of commercial management and what's offered when horses are at pasture. Now, what we've got here is the Kaplan-Meier curves for the transit time. And so what we've got here is the idea of the behavior, or the I guess it is behavior, the way that the horses process the different feeds. And so what we've got here is the idea, if we have a look, we've got the green arrow is pointing towards the curves for pasture 2 and pasture 3, which is the second and the third of the pasture washout periods. And then the what we're seeing there is the clustering of the conserved forages. So that was the hay and the ensiled forage. You're seeing that they're behaving very similarly, but we also find that what we call P1, the first pasture that was on offer during the first washout period, the transit time did not behave significantly different compared to the conserved forages. So we've got washout period 2 and 3 behaving typically what we'd actually see for horses offered large quantities of pasture, and reflects that reflects what we've seen in other transit time studies that we have done with different classes of livestock, equine livestock on pasture. And that P1 was behaving like the conserved forage. So immediately you're suddenly going, okay, hang on, what's going on here? Roughly 10 hours longer. So what we're looking at, the pasture 2 and pasture 3, we're talking about a mean transit time, looking at the median there, of about 24, 23 hours, and more like 32 hours, which is what we see, you know, published in the literature. So we've got a disparity here in transit time. The idea here of the what was the impact, or what was happening here, if we look at the feces voided, then this starts to give us a little bit of an idea of perhaps what was that driver, the driver of that transit time. And you can see that there was a lower quantity of feces voided, so there was a lower quantity of feed that was actually consumed. The feed consumed with all the others was a little bit more reflective of a true ad lib quantity, well, apart from hay and oats was slightly reduced voluntary feed intake. But the idea here is you can see that inadvertently we probably didn't provide as much pasture in front of those, cut pasture in front of those horses as perhaps we should have. And so then what we saw in that transit time is that with reduced voluntary feed intake, we got a drop in that transit time. And so that actually created this lovely, indirectly, this lovely model to start understanding what's the impact of transit time on the microbiota profile. The idea of, well, again, what I was saying before, the idea of the feed offered and a bit of an understanding. So we're talking round about, and it wasn't a huge reduction, but it was around about 6 kilograms dry matter on a dry matter basis, as opposed to about 7 that was consumed when the other feeds were offered. And so you can see, okay, there's about a 1 kilo drop there, and this had this impact on the idea of the on the transit time. Now, if we look at again, you know, we hark back to the idea of what we were saying with the seasonal supply, and the idea that we had the between horse variation, and there was between horse variation, and significant between horse variation. And so the nature and the magnitude of the way the horses responded to the feed on offer and the transit time. Some horses were consistently a higher transit time, and others had a lower transit time, demonstrating that there is within variation. But of course, when we looked at it and pulled it together, that we ended up clustering that this within horse rather than between horse, but within a horse, we saw this significant reduction in transit time as we inadvertently offered sort of this reduced feed intake. The idea of the percentage of observations within each treatment block, and you can see there if we go P1, P2, P3, and the idea there that this temporal pattern fits pretty much what we've seen with other observational studies. We've clumped these here. We haven't looked at it as a those blocks. This is over a 24-hour period, and the idea we look at it. We've got eating and resting taking up the vast majority of the time, and when we look at it, P1, it's a fraction less, which reflects that lower feed on offer as we had that reduced feed intake. Oh, we'll go back then. I should have actually said, when we talk about the observations between horses, there is that natural variation that we all see between horses, which is in the behavior of eating, which is reflected in the other parameters are of interest. Now, if we look here again, this is another principal component to try and look at the idea of what clustering we had. And so the idea that what happened. So those animals, the longer mean retention time, so the transit time, was associated with the reduced dry matter intake, and this again was associated with reduced feces voided. So again, we're starting to see this idea that, and we start thinking about the idea of, if we're talking about differences in forage and microbiota, that we also have to think about the relative quantities that are provided, because if we're providing them in different quantities, there's different dry matter intake, then that alters the transit time, and this has a possibility it has an impact on the microbiota. And we've got a little bit of data here to show you that actually is what goes on, and that is the effect. And so this is a confounding factor when we start looking at between diet effects on the microbiota. So I sort of said that, yeah, the dry matter intake, and as we said, it's probably inadvertently it ended up being a bit tight, but it was still within the bounds. It's not like we dramatically cut out that feed inadvertently and reduced what was going on. So the idea that we're within the bounds, about 1.3% of body weight is dry matter, even on that lower diet, or lower quantities of pasture on offer. Now, the microbiota, and again, this is the same protocol, so I won't talk about the protocol. I've just very quickly said, basically it's the classic 16 RS sequencing, the idea of what we're trying to achieve. The important bit here is the idea of when we sampled and the idea of what was going on. So fecal samples were collected at the time points of 0, 12, 24, 48, 72, 96 and 120 hours post dietary change. And so this is giving us a little bit of an idea of that relative window of when things change and what's going on. And the idea of these samples. So every time that a feces was voided, we collected the feces, recorded the time, and then quantified the relative transit time. So we're getting a pretty good map of when did things change and what was going on, and relative where that was with those markers, because we administered those markers via a nasogastric tube, so we knew how many were loaded, and the idea that was precisely at the time of that transition from one diet to the other. If we look at the idea of the diversity, and that's we've introduced those diversity indexes before, high levels of diversity between diets, and the idea here is they're significant. The pasture species is, yeah, the diversity and the idea of what's going on. We'll have a little bit of a look at the differences there between P1, P2, P3, and the relative drivers. They're behaving quite differently to some of the conserved forages. But again, you can sort of see when we look at the characteristics or some of the characteristics of what we're seeing with the microbiota, the P1 is behaving a little bit differently compared to what we're seeing with P2 and P3. So this transit time and the idea of it having an effect and sort of tweaking and changing and having, I guess, an impact or a manipulation on what we are actually seeing and the impact that that's going to have. Now, if we look at this figure here, it gives us a bit of an idea of, we've driven it back again. It's just showing these relative changes, slightly different than the cumulative box plots that we had, but it gives you a bit of an idea of what's been driven. And again, needless to say, it's our little friends again. It's Firmicutes and Bacteroides that are driving these relative changes in the relative contribution. So, again, we're talking about 80% of the microbiota being driven by this. But what we've got here, we've got A, P1, B's P2, and C is P3. And that's sort of what we're interested in. If you have a little bit of a look at the idea that these changes or the idea of the way the microbiota is responding to this change in the diet, and we start looking then at the idea of transit time, but the idea of the way it's responding is that we see that it actually is quite dynamic up to about 96 hours, and then it really sort of stabilizes and gets back into that, yeah, I'm happy. And so this sort of tells us that with these forage perturbations, the idea of perturbations in feed supply, that creates a disturbance, and we go back to this idea of microbiota and the idea of the ecology of it, the idea of these fluctuations, the oscillations, and then we get a stabilization back within that pattern. And again, start heading to a relatively consistent pattern as we progress along. And you can see again this idea of the Bacteroides and the Firmicutes that are the primary drivers. And we talked about these our other phyla that are sort of, they're contributing and they're playing, but they're not oscillating and changing as dramatically as our two friends, Bacteroides and Firmicutes. They are the ones that are bouncing around, and they sort of squeeze and give the nudge to the others. But they don't really change our other phyla. Now, what we've got here is another way. It's using a dendrogram to try and understand where we're sitting in the ideas of what we've got. So you can see that we do have quite distinct clusterings with our friends here with the conserved forages. They're all behaving in the same way, pastures in the same way. But our friend, when we restricted the feed intake on P1, that meant it didn't behave in that homogeneous, well, not that microbiota behaves, but it didn't respond in the same way or as a homogeneous pattern as what we were seeing in P2 and P3. And so that starts to tell us a little bit of an idea that, yes, while the nutrient and the substrate that was being offered basically to that microbiota was the same, that we're actually seeing very different natures in the way that they're responding based on basically in essence it comes down to the time that they're exposed to that substrate and what they're able to do with it. So if we then talk about the idea of coming back to what we saw with those stacked bar graphs and trying to understand what's going on, again, it's similar to what we saw previously, the idea of Bacteroides and Firmicutes driving it, and the idea of, okay, if we have a look, P1's a little bit closer to our, sort of getting more towards our ensiled than with P2 and P3, where we had the ad lib offering of the fresh pasture, and you can see the greater abundance of the the bacteroides in there rather at the expense of the firmicutes when we have large quantities of pasture offer. If we conserve that and there's a change in that transit time, then it starts behaving a little bit more as if we were offering the conserved forages, and so the firmicutes start to get a little bit more, for want of a better word, start to get a little bit more of a foothold and start to behave in that way. So what does this mean if we look at this, the idea of the from a what was happening and what we've got? And so you can sort of see, okay, we've got, if we look here, we've got the forages, they do behave the same, but you alter the transit time and that creates a bit of a tweak, and it starts to cause a little bit of this heterogeneity, or starting to move it more towards an intermediate between the conserved forages and the pasture. Whereas, you know, if we've got ad-lib, the conserved forages behave the same way. Or we've got there the hay and the oats, which is a very, you know, as you can imagine, is a slightly different profile, much higher dry matter intake. Then that behaves in the same that way. But from the idea of what's going on with the principal component, transit time does alter and does drive some of those changes. So it really highlights a little bit the idea that, okay, there are forages, yes, the substrate that's being offered to the horse and is the underpinning sort of nutrients that are available to the microbiota does drive the composition of the microbiota. But if we alter the quantity that's provided, then we tweak that, and that alters the way that the microbiota is responding. And it's something that we probably do need to think about as we go forward, looking at the microbiota in the horse and the impact that it has, and the way that the horse sort of has this dynamic opportunity to manipulate transit time and feed supply, and the availability for the relative extraction of nutrients. So that sort of takes us to the end of our journey on the story about transit time and microbiota and the impact that it has. So hopefully it's sort of been at least hopefully a little bit illuminating and a little bit of an idea, and giving you some things that are sort of worth thinking about and considering when you think about nutrition and nutritional trials, and the relative impact and the mechanisms on perhaps how the horse actually achieves some of these things.